I will start now. Can I go ahead? I know, shall I start? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we all can hear you.
Okay, so let's get started. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this very important topic, the role of CSOs in achieving net zero, taking specifically a climate justice perspective. We have already lost a lot of time, nearly 20 minutes. So I will be quick to catch up, and then I will maybe not go into as much detail as I wanted to, but you will still take quite a lot away from the presentation, I believe. So we are already experiencing a climate emergency. The United Nations Secretary General recently said that we should not even be talking about global warming, but that we should be talking about global heating. Now, the IPCC report that we published last year shows that, unfortunately, all the greenhouse gases are continuing to increase. The rate of the emission, the quantity of all the greenhouse gases have continued to increase compared to the last time that the report was published. The good news, they said, is that the rate of increase is not as much as before, but it is still increasing nonetheless. So the science is settled that human activities are having a dangerous impact on our climate system. And a lot of people are calling for a movement away from the traditional way in which development has occurred to a greener way of developing. And this is what we call making a transition from a carbon-intensive industrial system to a low-carbon industrial system. Now, the challenge is that while transition is inevitable, justice is not. And this is a central slide I want you to pay attention to, this point I'm making. It is impossible to stop the transition. The transition has already gone underway. It has already started. The transition is inevitable. Technological advancement, policy processes, legal advancements, market dynamics, the pressure from the youth, CSOs, and a range of others indicate that the transition is already inevitable. There are at least 15 countries that have already made commitment that they will no longer use fossil fuel cars in their jurisdiction starting from 2035 going forward. The price of solar panels and other renewable technologies are falling. Many companies are divesting from fossil fuel. So the transition is already underway. However, justice cannot be guaranteed. So we must have a particular lens of justice in order to ensure that the transition is equitable and fair. Otherwise, it is possible to imagine a situation where we have a transition from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy that ends up making those who did not contribute to the problem poorer. So that's why we need an attention to justice as we are pursuing this transition world. Now, this graph shows you, and this is produced by the ILO, the International Labour Organization. You can see from my left, the socio-economic impacts of climate action. You can see that the cost of transition varies from a country, from continent to continent. It varies from continent to continent. Now, you can see that Middle East, for example, is going to lose money, while some part of Europe will gain money. And Africa will also be at the losing end in terms of the net job gain through the implementation of the Paris Agreement in the energy sector specifically. This is very crucial. Africa will lose jobs. Asia Pacific will gain. Middle East will lose. Even though the overall average job gain is positive, Africa and Middle East will lose jobs. Now go to the right, you will see that there will also be a huge risk of gender inequity. The inclusive transition, the amount of job and the new types of job that will be created will result in negative effect for women and positive effect for men. So this is just a sample to show that the transition is not inherently just. So we have to campaign and advocate for equitable transition. And that's why you hear this concept of just transition all over the place. And the reason why we have to campaign for a just transition is because climate change itself has justice components. Okay, it has many justice implications and dimensions. Now, Nigeria has declared a net zero target, but the justice implications of this net zero target need to be well understood so that the CSOs can advocate not just for the country, the continent, or the world to strive towards meeting a net zero target, but that they do so in a way that is consistent with the ethics, with justice, with fairness, with equity. Now, there is no doubt that if we continue the way that we are going, we will hit net zero, we will hit 1.5 degrees by about 2040, 2045. And so getting to net zero by 2050 is really critical to if we want to stand any chance of meeting 1.5. Although there are some people who argue that 1.5 is already inevitable, that we're going to overshoot 1.5. That the question is really how much we overshoot before coming down. But net zero is necessary to achieve the more ambitious and transformative climate target. So making reductions here and there is not sufficient. We need to move to net zero if we want to stay within the strong Paris Agreement. The impact of climate change is not distributed equitably. So when we're talking about the climate change, we need to understand that the impact is not equitable and the emission pathways can be equitable or inequitable depending on how it is organized. Now, I'm going to skip this for time, but I always like to show this graph to show that there are many ways in which you can deal with climate change without necessarily thinking about justice. And these, we call them the management approaches or the technocratic approaches. You can, for example, use what we call solar radiation management. You can do carbon sequestration. You can do carbon capture and storage. You can do ocean acidification, cloud seeding, putting some mirrors in the atmosphere. All these scientific ways that don't really care about where you reduce the emission, who is causing the emission, the cost of the reduction, the impact on livelihoods. They are technocratic. You can also do emission trading, that allows those who are emitting more to sell and make money. And sometimes you can even design it in such a way that those who are responsible for causing the problem can even make more money as a result of taking action. For example, when the EU ETS started, the European Emission Trading System, we found out that cement companies, steel companies, chemical companies that are actually having the greatest impact on climate change were the ones making a hell of profit from the emission trading system. You can also do a carbon tax that ends up collecting from the poor and giving to the rich. So this is why, for example, the fuel subsidy argument we're having in Nigeria now, how do you ensure that you approach the removal of the fuel subsidy in a way that is progressive, that does not punish those who are already poor? So the point I'm making that it's possible to think about various ways of approaching climate mitigation adaptation that does not consider justice. And that would be unfair because there is a strong link between climate change and justice. And this link resides in about 4 or 5 key issues. Number one, historically, there is a strong link between development and emission. Number two, the carbon budget is reducing. Number three, those that contributed, there is certain parts of the world that have contributed more to the situation that we are in than the others. Number four, the impact is not distributed equitably or equally. And number five, not everybody has the same voice in deciding what to do on this issue. And all these 5 key issues are what link justice to climate action. And let's quickly go through them. Number one, I said there is a strong link between emissions and development. And you can see to the right hand, there's a strong link between GDP per capita in real term and the amount of energy that countries use. Those who use more tend to have more GDP per capita. You can see US and Canada and Germany having very high level of GDP per capita, but also having high use of energy. If you turn to the left, you can see there's a strong relationship between total amount of energy and total and real GDP, you see. So historically, there is a strong link between development and emissions. The implication is that those who have low emission are also those who have low development, and improving livelihood and achieving development is a legitimate aspiration from all countries. So how do you now stop or decouple emissions from development? Or how do you then compensate those who want to develop, but there is no more carbon space? This is a central justice issue. So this graph shows again the point. If you look to the left bottom, you see that all African countries, West Africa, East Africa, India, Sri Lanka, Southern and Middle Africa, they are towards the left. They have very low historic index for human development, but they also have low emission per capita. And then if you go to the right, to the extreme, you have those who have very high human development index. But if you go, you see that they have very high emissions. USA, Canada, up there, Australia and New Zealand up there, and Europe not too far from them. So you can see that there is a strong link between industrial development and emissions. So this is a big challenge for justice. I've already talked about the fact that maybe even if we have a strong link between development and emissions, it would not have been a problem, except that the fact that the carbon budget is getting lower and lower, smaller and smaller. So there is not enough room for those who have the need to develop and to burn more carbon. There's not enough room for them to do that. So how do you compensate them, given the fact that historically they are not the ones that have contributed the most to the climate change? This is a question of justice. It's not just about technology, about net zero. It's about who should carry the pain, who should bear the consequences, the financial consequences of achieving net zero. So you can see this bucket that the EU historically, the USA, China, India, the bucket is almost full. So how do we find the space for the rest of the world to develop, given the fact that all the countries have to achieve net zero? Now, this is the chart showing differences in contribution. You can see that 1.7 billion people and 1.3 billion people, the global Africa, have contributed the very, very least, whereas smaller countries or continents with high income groups and by regions, there is huge asymmetry in contribution to climate change. Now, justice questions are quite tricky because it is one thing to say, well, there has been a symmetry in contribution, but it is not always easy to know what is just. So if you look at this, you can see that China has the greatest number of contribution in absolute terms, okay, followed by USA. But if you then look at this, you see that in terms of per capita, China is still lower than the USA. Okay. So when you are talking about justice, are you going to be talking about justice in absolute terms, or will you be talking about justice in terms of per capita emission? These are questions that the NGOs and CSOs need to be aware of. The other point that CSOs need to be aware of is that actually in the last 40 years, the largest amount of emissions have been coming from developing countries. So when people criticize TT or IDU or climate advocates and say, why are you guys campaigning for net zero in Nigeria? This is a graph that you can use to answer that, to say, well, it is true that historically, developing countries have not contributed the most. But if you look at the last 40 years, the bulk of the emissions have come from developing countries, including and mostly from Asia. But also the emissions of Nigeria, South Africa, and some other African countries are continuing to rise. For example, in Africa, I think Nigeria is the second highest emitter. So it is important that we think about how we can reduce emissions and join the rest of the world in achieving net zero. But we have to do that in a way that is sensitive to justice and equity and fair play. The other reason that we can give for why it's important for a country like Nigeria to be pursuing net zero is because actually we are the ones that are bearing the greatest impact of climate change. So even if you say, well, this thing is a white man problem, let them go and deal with it. Well, I think it's mistaken because from the flooding, from desertification, from drought, from health issues, poor countries are the ones that are carrying the biggest burden of climate change. So we really need to join the rest of the world. But again, as I said, we must do so in a way that is sensitive to justice. So this is the work that we did with Maldives many years ago. They had this meeting under the water to show that Maldives was going to completely be inundated at a 1.5, even 1.5 degrees warming. So when we talk about the global average of 1.5, we must realize that for countries such as Nigeria, the average warming is much higher than the global. So this is important. The other justice angle is about what we call voice. There is such a huge asymmetry in voice in the decision-making arena. Rich countries have more people attending negotiation meetings. They are more prepared, they are more skilled, they are more vast, they are more knowledgeable. And many times we are not able to match them in terms of negotiation skills and number. So when I was full-time in Oxford, I got my PhD student to really do the number crunching, to count the number of people that were coming to COP meetings. So if you take, for example, the second two countries, Germany and Ethiopia, you see that there are roughly 80 million people. But you can go down now, you see 2000, 75.5, 2001, 56.3, 2002, 54.3, and on you see that there is an issue of voice. So in advocating or campaigning for net zero, it is important to campaign around the issue of strengthened voice of developing country and CSOs. Now, how can CSO contribute to this? I think the first thing I wanted to do is to make a distinction between advocacy and campaign, because I think that these are the two main areas where CSO can play a role. Advocacy is the act of supporting a particular cause or issue, often through public speaking, writing, or organizing events. So as I'm speaking now, I am an advocate for a net zero, and I'm an advocate for a net zero that imbibes justice and equity concerns. But I am not campaigning because of this speech. A speech can be a part of a campaign, but an advocacy is different from campaign. So the two main things that CSOs can do to support and push for a net zero that is climate justice sensitive is advocacy and campaign. Campaigning can be seen as the process of advancing advocacy. Okay, examples of other campaigns can be campaign for access to health, campaign for access to clean water, campaign for justice, campaign for education, child rights, LGBT, housing, access to housing, etc., etc. These are the two biggest ways that CSOs can contribute. Now, when you want to run a campaign or advocacy, I think you need to be careful to choose the right approach. There are at least 5 key approaches to advocacy or campaign. No one is superior to the other. What you need to do is to make your analysis and decide which one you want to do. Sometimes you can also do a combination. You want to collaborate with policymakers. This works when you have people, friends that are policymakers, when policymakers are listening, when they are, they are willing to collaborate and cooperate with you. If policymakers are opposed, they don't listen, they are not collaborative, they are antagonistic, then collaboration will not work. You may then have to go for direct persuasion. Sometimes you may even have to go for coercive pressure, like when you bring people on the street, you organize a march, you do a fanfare, and you call them out. Another way to campaign or advocate for net zero that the CSO can adopt is litigation. They go to court. And I'm not saying you should do that, but if you think about it, Nigeria have a net zero target and then a climate change act. But actually, Nigeria is very vulnerable now. I know that Nigeria doesn't listen, not all the time, to court injunctions. But we have fallen foul of several provisions of the National Climate Change Law. The National Climate Change Law gave 8 months and no more than 12 months since the inauguration of the council to have a carbon budget. We still don't have that carbon budget. The Climate Change Act mandates the National Climate Change Council to have a national framework for climate action, no less than 9 months after inauguration. Today, we still don't have it. And there are many other provisions that the Climate Change Act has that Nigeria is not keeping. So CSO can push through litigation. Another way is to build support, rally around through other CSO actors. So, but this is a fundamental slide that for CSOs to be very effective, they need to think very, very carefully about the approach that they want to use. And the right approach depends on the analysis of the external and internal environment. It is also important for CSOs when they are campaigning or advocating for net zero to be aware that campaign is a war of persuasion. And a war of persuasion requires you to be very skilled in what you're talking about, to be knowledgeable about your field. And it's to remember that it's not enough for people to care or to know or even to spread concern. You need to motivate people to take action. So for our Nigerian CSOs that are campaigning for net zero, what are the 3 or 4 key actions that you are pressuring the government to take? You remember 2 years ago when my NGO ran a campaign for Nigeria to inaugurate the council. The action was very simple. 8 months after the Climate Change Act had been signed by Buhari, the council has not been inaugurated. So we ran a campaign simply on this point. We are calling urgently on the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Buhari, the Attorney General, Malami, and the Minister for Environment to urgently inaugurate the Climate Change Council. So the call to action was very clear. So you need to have very clear call to action. Some of us have produced a lot of work that can help you to identify what is the specific call to action. For example, I've already given 2 examples of a call for action that you can go for. That the carbon budget needs to be instituted, or that the Nigeria MRV need to be instituted, or that the framework for action need to be. We need a call for action, and Nigeria is a very interesting place, and I'm not trying to ask anyone to go and get into trouble. But campaign or advocacy is not always an easy business. You don't always have to be polite, and it's not always a noble business. I know that we would sometimes like to treat government with his glove and tell them nice things. But if we really want to get action, we must be prepared to sometimes be bold and to speak truth to power. Okay? And when you are campaigning or advocating for net zero, the idea is not to punish the oil companies or to punish cement companies or to punish anyone at all. It is better to focus on solutions. And if you want to campaign for solutions for net zero, you need to understand motivations. Why are people doing what they are doing? Why are the cement companies not reducing emissions? Why are the oil companies not reducing emissions? Why are we celebrating the Dangote refinery when we know that it's going to add so much emissions to Nigeria and basically blow the net zero target off the waters? So when we understand the reasons why government or private sector or are doing what they are doing, then you will be able to tackle those motivations. You can say, well, it is true that investing in more oil and gas can bring more jobs, but it's going to lead to stranded assets. And by the way, we have comparative advantage in solar, in wind, so we can also invest in this, and you can bring the analysis to show that investing in renewables can bring more jobs than investing in fossil fuel. But you need to understand their motivation so that you are able to counter it. You also need to understand power. Those who have power don't want to lose it. And you also need to understand the issue of structure and strategy. Okay? So campaigning for net zero can bring a lot of benefits. It can create gearing. It provokes conversation in the society. It can help to set agenda, and it can remedy the democratic deficit, because sometimes the decisions are taken not in a way that involve the civil society. So it is the role of the civil society to try and remedy this democratic deficit by insisting for the voice of the wider public in setting the agenda for net zero. And for a campaign to be successful, it has to appeal to the economic, political, and emotional aspects of the issue. Many people know that smoking is not good. It harms their health, but they cannot quit. And just making an argument of economy may not be sufficient. You may make the argument of the political, the emotional, and the spiritual. And you need to combine all these dimensions in order to be effective in achieving your objectives. It is important to offer credible solutions. Don't just say, well, Nigeria needs to go net zero, Nigeria needs to join the war to go. What are the credible alternatives or pathways through which Nigeria can achieve net zero and still have a decent economy? And how can we do that in a way that is sensitive to justice and equity? And this is where you need to argue that, yes, Nigeria has to be doing something and to be shown to be doing something, but also that we need the support of the international community to help Nigeria, because we are not largely the ones that have contributed the most to this problem. So you need to have those two angles covered. You need to have a winning battle and war strategy, and you need to make your argument very communicable. It is important that when we communicate in the way that people will understand. Net zero may not be well understood. Are there ways that we can make this terminology easier to assimilate? And I want to also let you know that campaign is not the same thing as education. When you are educating people, you can do problem analysis, create awareness, you go for knowledge, you do understanding, you do further reflection, and then you do more reflection and further understanding. And sometimes it leads to nothing other than confusion. When you are making advocacy or campaign, you are calling people to action, from problem analysis to awareness, to creating concern, to creating a sense of urgency, and then to even creating anger or hope that can result in action. So always think about this. Where is the decision? Who needs to take the decision? What is the mechanism through which they need to take the decision? Who are your audience? What do you want them to hear? How can you best reach them, both directly and indirectly? And what is your proposition? What is the action that you are calling? You know what you want to change. You do an issue mapping to understand the barriers to change. You do your research and analyze the problem. Then you select the advocacy aim and objective. Remember that slide I showed you. What are your tactics? Then you make sure you have an understanding of the stakeholders and the wider context. And then also make sure you assess your own capacity, your capability. And based on these things, you can then design your strategy for campaign. So you select the issue, you select the intervention that you want to use, you prove the concept, you identify the critical paths and proposition. Also, very critically, you have to have a communication strategy. As a CSO or an NGO that is campaigning, what is your communication strategy? And then your communication strategy and your intervention has to match the resources that you have. Then you roll out. And when you roll out, you should be careful to monitor the impact that you are having, and then you design a nice cycle. I know that the 21st century, the climate advocacy, the ICCDI have been going around the country trying to raise awareness. Do we have a way of monitoring the impact of what we are doing? Have we thought deeply about our CS communication strategy? Very important, so that we are able to then monitor our impact and then make changes when we need to. Titi and I were together in Abuja a few weeks ago, and I spoke at length about the importance of research. Research is also critical for effective advocacy. Research is foundational to success. If you don't do research, you wouldn't know what options to preach or to advocate. You wouldn't even know why people are doing what they are doing. You will not have accurate evidence to support your campaign or your advocacy. And research is also what gives you feasible and workable solutions, establishes your reputation as an expert, and provides you with case studies and examples of where it has worked in the past and how you can encourage any country where you're advocating for a net zero to follow this path, that it can produce results. Okay? Research will also help you to disprove all the myths, the rumors, and the false assumptions around net zero, so that you can bring clear evidence to support your positions. When you are thinking of solutions, think about there's a kind of four themes that you can think about in terms of talking about solutions. Number one, your solution must be feasible. Number two, your solution must be credible. Number three, your solution must be workable. And it's even better if your solution is attractive. We don't have plenty of time, otherwise I could have developed this point. But I trust that it's very simple, that you need to have feasible solution, credible solution, workable solution, and solutions that are attractive. So it's not attractive to go and tell Nigeria, you must reach net zero, even if people end up being more poor. You must reach net zero, even if you lose jobs. You must achieve net zero, whether you get money from international organizations or not. There's not going to be an attractive proposition to any country. So wherever you are advancing net zero advocacy, make sure that you've thought through why should this option be attractive to the country that I'm talking about. Also think in terms of what are the low-hanging fruits for that country. For Nigeria, an obvious low-hanging fruit is that you can actually you have a lot of sun, and that you can increase the amount of energy generated and help to address energy poverty by harnessing the energy from natural resources. It's a low-hanging fruit. Okay. Think also of the ripe fruit, what they can do now. And also think about the big one. Okay. So these are the kind of decisions that you need to be thinking through. When you are advocating for change, who will make that decision? who needs to approve that decision, so that you're not campaigning to thin air or lavishing your time and effort where it will not have good impact. Finally, I want to end with the issue of communication. This graph helps to tell you the things to think through when you are making communication. The channel, how the message gets to your audience. The action, what you want your audience to do. The messenger, you yourself that is preaching, make sure that you are credible and legitimate. If you are, for example, riding a big Jeep, and then you come and tell people, we need to do net zero, they will look at your Jeep outside and say, hey, a Corolla or a Camry will emit less. But then you are flying around the world having a big Jeep, and then you are saying people to tighten their belt. That's why when the president had a 120 car convoy, people were not happy, because we said, no, that we want to reduce the use of fuel and emission. And we're trying to distribute palliatives. But now we're having a 120 car convoy. So CSOs who are advocating for climate action need to also watch their behavior. Then program, why are they doing it? The context where and when the message arrives, and the audience who we are communicating with. And finally, you must think about the trigger. What will motivate your audience or the government to act? Keep your communications short and simple. Use visual to communicate net zero. Show how it can be done. Create events. Tell stories about real people that are making real change. Be proactive. Understand your context and frames, so that you'll be able to communicate in a way that will bring action. So I'll leave it there. But I have made a lot of points about the various ways that NGOs, CSO, can push for a net zero so that they can be effective. Thank you very much. I can't hear anybody. I don't know whether people heard me. Titi, you're on mute.
Yeah, questions, comments?
Titi, I think you're saying something, but I didn't quite hear you.
Can you hear us?
It's better now. I can hear. Are there any questions? Because I'll soon have to run to a different meeting.
Yes, there is. Somebody's asking.
Okay. Okay. Let's have all the questions as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. Yes, we have seen the issue of a political will on policy framework and how we can drive the most especially the state components to key into one voice. I think this is a major issue that we in the CSO are actually facing. We see that each of the states has different opinions, has different activities. So how do we coordinate such activities in such a way that we can have a single voice? Maybe we have some platform of states that are working on energy. We have some platform of states that are protecting forests. We have some platform of states that are working on maybe coastal area restoration. How do we go about this to be able to communicate this appropriately with national climate change communication programs? Thank you, sir.
Okay. Are there other questions? Let's have all the questions.
Any other question, please? Okay, Prof. No other. You can continue, sir. You can move on, sir. No other questions.
Fantastic. Well, the issue of synergy is very, very important. Synergy is even more important for your case because of resources. There is so little resources here. And if you have limited resources, then you need to really make sure that you are not duplicating effort and increasing redundancies in the system. Unfortunately, many times CSOs are not well coordinated. But experience has shown that when CSOs are well coordinated, they can actually punch far above their weight. They can punch far above their weight. You can see 2 or 3 or 5 CSOs that have very limited resources, but because they are coordinating effectively, sharing information, rejecting redundancies, you can see that they will have major impact. I think that TT is 21st century is actually leading a work now that can contribute to this coordination. It has to be, someone has to take it up, compile a list of the CSOs, and then create an understanding who is strong where. You know, the CSOs in the north may have a different focus, campaigning on arid situations, on desertification, on deforestation. The CSOs in the south may be better campaigning on issues of environmental and air pollution arising from oil spill or from coastal inundation. Let's ensure that we are coordinating effectively, because when we coordinate, we are able to achieve better results. Government can also help, but of course, as you know, political will is very limited. Government is busy doing their own thing and helping to infuse dynamism and coordination among the CSOs is not the priority of the government. If you go to the UK or the US, you see a lot of funding coming from the government to CSOs, because government knows that they cannot do it all. They need to strengthen the CSOs to be able to be effective. It's almost like training the police that will police you. But we recognize that they are not enemies. They are working synergistically and symbiotically. But here, government is busy looking for its own resources, and they don't bother so much with the CSOs. So I am hoping that coordination will improve over time, because, as I said, with coordination and synergy, we can do more. So thanks very much, and I wish you fruitful deliberation going forward. And I really want to emphasize that without CSOs, there will be a big gap in achieving not just the NDC, but climate action in Nigeria. So I encourage you to keep fighting and to keep the spirit high. Take care and have a very good day.
Okay, stop. Okay, so before we go into the book section, we have to talk about total points here from the conclusions. So we just invite them to share their feedback with us for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So thanks to colleague Sideline to give us the spirit of platform.
Good afternoon once again. I'm going to share some of the lessons we learned and feedback from our community engagement on net zero, the summary of the United States. We did